Hello, and thank you for joining me for this FedWatch briefing. Today, I'd like to walk you through one of the most recent significant developments under the Federal Endangered Species Act, the final rule issued by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and National Marine Fisheries Service rescinding the regulatory definition of harm, which was published in the Federal Register on July 14th. Since this rule was proposed, we've had conversations with a diversity of clients across both private and public sector projects. Their questions have been very similar. What's changed? Does this affect my project? Do I still need to do consultation? Will a habitat conservation plan still be needed? These are the questions I'd like to answer today. We'll spend our time discussing what this means in practice for environmental planning and permitting. First off, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Barbra Calantas, and I'm ESA's Biological Resources and Land Management Practice Leader. I have 25 years of experience as an environmental consultant and wildlife biologist with expertise in supporting our clients with biological analysis, endangered species permitting strategy, and habitat conservation plan implementation. I'm also a member of ESA's FedWatch team. We're a group of senior practitioners who actively monitor policy changes at the federal level and assess implications on environmental planning and permitting. You're welcome to stay in touch with me, ask me any questions that come up for you via my email on this slide, and that QR code will get you to my LinkedIn page. Please connect with me. So here is the organization of my presentation. We'll start with a brief refresher on how the term harm has evolved over time. We'll talk about the regulatory changes that have led us to this final ruling. And then we'll discuss a brief summary of the harm ruling, as well as examine the potential implications on FESA permitting via project example scenarios. And I say FESA as just a shorter way to say Federal Endangered Species Act. We'll end with some thoughts on what to watch for, and then recommendations to consider. So I welcome any questions that might come up during the course of this presentation. In this on-demand format, you're welcome to snap a photo with your smartphone of the QR code there, or go down into the description for this video where you'll also see a link to submit questions. They will come directly to me, and we'll try to get a rapid response back. So before going into the rule itself, it's helpful to understand how we got here. Let's take a look at how harm has evolved over time through several significant legal milestones. First off, 1973, that is the year that Congress enacted FESA. The statute prohibited take of endangered species and included harm in the definition of take, but what's important to note is that Congress did not define what harm meant. A few years later, in 1975, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service adopted implementing regulations where, for the first time, they defined harm, specifically focusing on direct acts against wildlife. In 1981, the definition was revised. Fish and Wildlife Service amended the regulation to clarify that harm could include significant habitat modification or degradation if it actually killed or injured wildlife by impairing essential behaviors such as breeding, feeding, or sheltering. So this is really where the current version of harm that we've been putting into practice for the last several decades was defined. And in 1995, the U.S. Supreme Court affirmed this interpretation in the case Babbitt versus Sweet Home Chapter of Communities for a Great Oregon. Here, the court upheld the regulatory definition of harm, confirming that habitat modification resulting in actual injury or death to wildlife could constitute take. And so when we talk about take and how the definition of harm relates to that, I just want to illustrate a couple of examples to get us level set on how this comes into play. So one example, filling a stream with known Atlantic salmon is accepted as take because it eliminates spawning habitat, potentially impairing breeding or survival. In a terrestrial example, permanent habitat conversion for a listed bird such as the Florida scrub jay is considered take because it impairs feeding, foraging, and shelter, resulting in injury to the animal. So for decades, us as practitioners have operated under the understanding that significant habitat modification could constitute prohibited take. More recently, however, several developments have really changed the legal landscape. So in June 2024, we all might remember Loper Bright versus Raimondo, which is the Supreme Court case that overturned the Chevron deference, increasing judicial scrutiny of federal agency interpretations or statutes that influence how agencies develop and defend regulations. Now, this case is particularly relevant because many commentators, including the services themselves, have recognized that it changed the legal landscape for administrative rulemaking. While the July 2026 rescission of harm in the final rule was not legally required by Loper Bright, the decision has been cited as part of the broader shift towards relying more closely on statutory text and less on agency interpretations when promulgating and defending regulations. Then last year, in February 2025, the administration responded with Executive Order 14219, which shorthand we are calling the Direction for Deregulation. And this executive order essentially directed federal agencies to review existing regulations and required them to identify regulations that may be inconsistent with the plain language of the statutes, recent Supreme Court decisions such as Loper Bright, or the administration's regulatory priorities. So rather than this executive order automatically changing regulations, it's important to note that instead it directed the agencies to take a fresh look at whether their existing regulations remain legally and policy appropriate. So in response, the services reviewed FESA implementing regulations, and what they concluded is that the regulatory definition of harm warranted reconsideration. The services then proposed rescinding the regulatory definition because they concluded it extended beyond the statutory language enacted by Congress. So what does this mean? In the final ruling, essentially, in simple terms, the services assert that the definition of harm, which includes significant habitat modification or degradation, contradicts the best meaning of take. Now, what does that mean? How do we put that into practice? What this means is that a proposed action that alters habitat for listed species is not equivalent to an act that directly injures or kills fish or wildlife. If we impact habitat, it's not the same thing as directly injuring or killing fish or wildlife. Now we'll get into a brief examination of how the final rule has different implications for three key FESA provisions, specifically Section 9, 7, and 10. So Section 9 in FESA essentially is where take is defined. This final rule is focused specifically on this provision of FESA, rescinding the regulatory definition of harm, eliminating habitat modification as a standalone basis for defining take, and now habitat modification alone generally no longer serves as the basis for take under the services interpretation. From the proposed to final rule, it's important to note there weren't any substantive changes to the language. Now, Section 10. This is one aspect of the final rule that has not received much commentary in its implications because likely it was not really discussed much in the proposed rule. So this is a pretty significant change from proposed to final. Essentially, what the final rule concludes is that there are going to be potential implications for future FESA Section 10 habitat conservation plans and incidental take permits. And as a reminder, Section 10 answers the question of whether a non-federal action results in take, which is defined by Section 9. So certainly a connection between take and both Section 10 and Section 7, but I just wanted to make that point here. So really the only question Section 10 is asking is the project going to result in take of a listed species, specifically for projects without a federal nexus? Although the final rule does not amend the Section 10 regulations, it does signal how the services intend to administer the existing program and acknowledges that future rulemaking may be needed. Traditionally, as we know, many HCPs emphasize habitat acreage because habitat modification itself could establish take. So going forward, we may see a greater emphasis on avoiding direct injury through project design, timing restrictions, or other very focused species-specific measures. And we'll go more into that. But before we dive into Section 10, I wanted to also highlight the impacts of this rule on Section 7. So I think for most of us, Section 7 is the most common provision we deal with in our industry. And as a reminder, under Section 7, there are 3 questions we are asked for a project's effects. Specifically, the services require that we evaluate jeopardy, we evaluate adverse modifications to designated critical habitat, and we also evaluate species take. So because we have 2 other questions we're answering outside of the question on take, generally, under the final rule, Section 7 consultation mostly remains unchanged. And a big part of that is because when we are analyzing jeopardy, we are addressing impacts to habitat as it results to potential habitat fragmentation that could affect the viability of a species population over time. We are addressing jeopardy from the perspective of whether or not loss of habitat affects essential behaviors such as foraging and breeding. And so considering habitat within Section 7 is still something that is required and is separate from what we have to do when we consider if there is take on a listed species within Section 7. And we're going to go more into that. But first, let's talk about Section 10. And so from understanding the impacts of rescinding harm from take, because that is the question, that is the primary one we're answering for Section 10, future HCPs and incidental take permits could place greater emphasis on the following. Activities that create a demonstrable risk of direct injury or mortality to listed species, project design features that avoid or minimize direct encounters with fish and wildlife, operational practices that reduce take during construction or maintenance, and last, species-specific conservation measures tied to direct biological effects on species rather than habitat acreage alone. And so let's examine this a bit further by thinking through potential project scenarios. And we'll first start with covering these first 2 parts, emphasis on injury mortality and focus on avoiding and minimizing effects. So, scenario project. A private applicant-led solar project is proposed in the desert with permanent disturbance of desert tortoise habitat. There are no other federal triggers, no federal funding. The site does not occur on federal land. It's on private land. There are no impacts that we are addressing for waters and wetlands regulated under the Clean Water Act. So in this case, it's just the permanent disturbance of desert tortoise habitat. The traditional approach would be very habitat focused. The HCP would require preservation or restoration of habitat based on the acreage impacted. And one of the approaches to addressing that would be conducting offsite conservation land preservation. So this conservation emphasis is really compensating for habitat loss. Now, the potential future approach would be very species focused. Rather than emphasizing habitat acreage alone, the HCP would focus on reducing the likelihood of direct injury or mortality by a number of conservation measures, including these examples, things like conducting pre-construction surveys to locate desert tortoises within the project footprint, installing temporary exclusion fencing around construction areas to keep tortoises from entering active work zones, restricting or modifying blasting and vegetation clearing where active occupied burrows are present to avoid direct mortality. So how does this illustrate the shift? The conservation measures focus on preventing direct take of individual desert tortoises by reducing the risk of injury or death during project construction and operation, rather than relying primarily on preserving habitat acreage or compensating with restoration of habitat to offset impacts. Now let's look at how HCPs and ITPs might include operational practices that reduce take during construction or maintenance, and what it means to focus conservation measures on direct species effects. Some of this might sound familiar with what I just covered. So this scenario project is ongoing vegetation management and maintenance along a utility transmission corridor that crosses habitat occupied by the federally listed coastal California gnatcatcher. The traditional approach would be very habitat focused. It may have focused primarily on the acreage of habitat temporarily or permanently disturbed by activities such as vegetation clearing, access road maintenance, equipment staging, and replacement of utility structures. The conservation strategy might have required purchasing conservation or mitigation bank credits, compensating for habitat loss using an acreage-based mitigation ratio. Really, under this approach, the habitat disturbance itself could serve as an important basis for seeking incidental take authorization, even when the likelihood of directly injuring or killing an individual animal was pretty low. Now, the potential future approach would be very species focused. The HCP and incidental take permit could place greater emphasis on the way routine construction and maintenance activities are performed, particularly where those activities create a demonstrable risk of directly injuring or killing the gnatcatcher. So operational practices could include things like conducting pre-activity surveys before vegetation clearing, grading, or equipment access, establishing gnatcatcher-specific exclusion zones around known occupied nest, and then limiting vehicle speeds and restricting equipment to designated access routes. Now, how does this illustrate the shift? Again, the conservation strategy focuses less on habitat acreage alone and more on how construction and maintenance activities are performed to prevent direct take of listed wildlife. So as we reflect on these examples, I think what feels logical is that projects without a federal nexus may experience a bigger change in permitting requirements compared to projects with a federal nexus. Under this new rule, if habitat modification is the only identified effect to listed wildlife and no other form of prohibited take is expected, the revised interpretation may reduce or eliminate the need for Section 10 incidental take authorization. So let's explore that with another potential scenario project. Here I'm showing a residential developer may propose a 2,000-acre master plan community on private land that provides habitat for the northern spotted owl. And this project otherwise does not require a federal permit or federal funding. So if habitat modification of northern spotted owl habitat alone were expected to result in incidental take, the developer likely would have pursued a Section 10 HCP and incidental take permit under the previous framework. Now, under the new rule, if that is no longer considered take, a Section 10 permit may no longer be required. I do want to caution, though, that whether an incidental take permit is required is going to continue to depend on the project-specific circumstances, and that the presence of other prohibited forms of take are also going to factor in. So any projects involving direct injury or mortality to listed wildlife may still require incidental take authorization. And it's important to note that NEPA and other state environmental laws like CEQA in California, where I live, or state endangered species laws, state aquatic features regulations, and other local regulatory programs may continue to require permits and habitat avoidance, minimization, or mitigation, regardless of this federal rule. So now what does this mean for Section 7? Remember I said we'd come back to this. And when we think about a comparison between these types of projects, I really think that the impacts to Section 7 projects are going to be less. And here's why. We'll look at this example project here. So here, what we're going to examine is a highway improvement project funded by the Federal Highway Administration. So that's the trigger for the federal nexus. And this project is going to have impacts to habitat known to be occupied by federally listed mammal species. So, when we think about the impacts to HCPs, an easy conclusion to make is that there could be a result of less take if we are no longer considering loss of habitat alone as take. And similarly to the HCP effects we just described, where there's a potential for less HCPs and incidental take permits, maybe we would think that we would have less biological opinions issued. However, it is much more nuanced than that. Remember, when I talked about Section 7 earlier, that Section 7 answers the question of whether take occurs, but also whether a project proponent is going to result in a project with a jeopardy finding. And that jeopardy question is, will the action jeopardize the continued existence of the species? And here we specifically look at habitat. Some of the typical questions we have to answer when we are considering jeopardy is, does habitat loss reduce the species' survival or recovery? Does fragmentation affect population viability? Are these cumulative effects to habitat significant enough to affect the species' continued presence? We also have to evaluate whether or not critical habitat is adversely modified as a result of the proposed action. So in this example of this highway improvement, we'd have to evaluate the loss of habitat and effects on designated critical habitat. For this project example, we could determine that the loss of habitat results in fragmentation that affects the breeding behaviors of this listed mammal species, as well as then the survival of this mammal on site, thus resulting in a jeopardy finding. So when we address the incidental take part of the Section 7 consultation, because that relies on Section 9, we might decide that there would be no take to species as a result of the habitat modification. But because we had a positive jeopardy finding, we will still determine here that the loss of habitat results in jeopardy and a biological opinion will be issued for a may affect determination. So as it relates to Section 7 consultation, while this rule will change how the services determine whether incidental take has occurred, the separate jeopardy and critical habitat questions that we have to answer still remain and are expected to continue much as they have in the past. And so this is why there is a difference between Section 10 and Section 7 permitting pathways as a result of this rule. And so what does this mean overall for mitigation negotiations? That's a question that is definitely coming up. And really one of the broader implications is that there may be a shift now in how mitigation is negotiated. And we've talked about that a little bit in our project examples, because essentially if habitat modification alone is no longer sufficient to establish incidental take, future projects may experience the following: less reliance on habitat-based mitigation, where habitat modification alone was the basis for incidental take; greater focus on direct take risks such as mortality, injury, nest or burrow destruction, crushing, entrapment, and vessel strikes; more emphasis on avoidance and minimization measures during construction and operations; and mitigation may become more species specific, targeting direct effects on listed species rather than habitat acreage alone. Now, interestingly, the services included an acknowledgement in the final rule that industry reliance interests, quote unquote, exist. In other words, they recognize that there has been an industry where many public agencies, private developers, utilities, conservation organizations, landowners, and environmental consultants like us have organized permitting and conservation strategies around the previous definition of harm. And yet the services determined that those practical consequences of how that reliance industry is going to be impacted could not override what they viewed as the proper statutory interpretation. So there's a lot we could digest there in really thinking about how industry is going to be impacted. But really the key point is this: habitat mitigation is unlikely to disappear. Projects are still going to need habitat avoidance, minimization, or compensation through Section 7 consultation specific to jeopardy and critical habitat review, state endangered species laws, Clean Water Act permitting, NEPA, and other state-focused environmental policies, as well as other federal, state, and local regulatory programs. So looking ahead, although the rule is now effective, its long-term implementation is likely to depend on future litigation, but also on the outcome of several additional FISA rulemakings. The services recently published broader revisions affecting critical habitat designations, species protections, and there is a pending rulemaking right now on Section 7 consultation. So together with anticipated updates to the Section 7 consultation handbook, these actions all suggest that FISA implementation will continue to evolve over the coming months and years. So project proponents should continue to monitor regulatory developments and identify permitting strategies that remain adaptable as this broader policy framework takes shape. ESA is committed to helping you with that. I just prepared a blog published on our website earlier this week regarding the July 21st final rule on critical habitat, with drafts in progress for the other rulings. Our FedWatch team will continue to stay alert for how these evolve so we can keep providing expert analyses on project implications. So considering the uncertainty and how implementation of this ruling may continue to evolve, our advice to clients remains consistent. Early environmental planning is still the best strategy for managing permitting risk. Project teams should continue to do the following: conduct early biological constraints analyses when considering early site selection and due diligence, distinguishing clearly between habitat impacts and direct effects to listed species, coordinating early with federal and state resource agencies, and reevaluating permitting strategies for projects entering FISA consultation. And lastly, as mentioned previously, monitor litigation and agency implementation guidance as the rule is challenged, and remain adaptable as federal policy continues to evolve. Lastly, I leave you with this recommendation to follow ESA on LinkedIn and monitor our Federal News blog page shown here, where we regularly post analyses on federal policy updates, as well as advertise upcoming webinars just like this, diving into the significant changes affecting environmental permitting. A wealth of information is available on this site, and if you've been here already, you know that it's been quite busy for us. Thank you again for joining us. I'll leave this QR code again and point you to the link in description for any lingering questions you want to ask. If you would like to discuss how these changes may affect a specific project or permitting strategy you're working on, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. Take care, and we'll see you next time.